As a quick reminder, glucose is the number one energy source for our body. That energy of glucose is contained in the chemical bonds holding this molecule together, especially in those chemical bonds that are holding hydrogen attached, because the hydrogens of glucose are carrying what's called high energy electrons, and we'll talk more about that towards the end. The energy contained in glucose is liberated and then recaptured in a usable form through a process called cellular respiration. In general, the chemical equation of cellular respiration looks like this. Glucose and oxygen go in, water, carbon dioxide, a bunch of ATP, the usable form of energy for our body, and some heat come out on the other side. That's a lot to look at, so let's focus on some big ideas here. A large compound, glucose, is broken down into some smaller compounds like water and carbon dioxide. By breaking that large compound down, we break some bonds, which releases some energy. That energy is eventually captured in the usable form of ATP. In order to fully break down glucose, oxygen gets used as part of this process, and carbon dioxide gets produced as we break carbons off of that glucose molecule. In order to liberate as much usable energy from glucose as possible, we need oxygen. Oxygen is one of the reactants that's going into this chemical equation. If oxygen is available, cellular respiration happens in 3 steps, called glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Of these 3 steps, carbon dioxide is produced only during the citric acid cycle. And of these 3 steps, the electron transport chain is where oxygen gets used. This electron transport chain is also the step where most of our ATP is being generated. Let's take a look at these 3 steps, starting with glycolysis. The actual equation and chemical process here looks very overwhelming at first, so let's focus on some big ideas. The name, glycolysis, indicates that glyco, or sugar, is getting broken apart, which is what lysis tells us. So glucose is going into this process. Glucose is relatively large, it's got 6 carbons, lots of hydrogens, it's got a whole bunch of chemical bonds that's storing a whole bunch of energy. We actually have to spend a little bit of energy in the form of ATP to begin breaking that glucose molecule down. As we do so, we wind up producing some smaller molecules. Instead of the 6-carbon glucose, we wind up breaking it in half to 2 3-carbon molecules. As we do this, we start to strip off some of those hydrogens that we said were so important because they're carrying high energy electrons. Those hydrogens are captured as part of another chemical called NADH. The H tells us it's attached to some of those important hydrogen atoms. As we strip those hydrogens off, though, a little bit of energy is released, and that energy is captured as a couple of molecules of ATP. Now, remember, we had to use a little bit of ATP to get this whole process started, and so we're only really capturing a very small amount of ATP in this glycolysis step by itself. More importantly, we've broken glucose in half to make 2 3-carbon molecules, which are called pyruvic acid. That pyruvic acid is still containing most of the energy that glucose had in the first place. That pyruvic acid that was made from glycolysis goes into the next step called the citric acid cycle, which takes place in the mitochondria of the cells. This pyruvic acid not only has carbons, but a lot of the hydrogens that were attached to the original glucose molecule still attached to them. These hydrogens get stripped off one by one during the citric acid cycle and captured as NADH and FADH2. All that really matters here is we're capturing these hydrogens that contain these high energy kinds of electrons. As we're stripping off those hydrogens, though, we wind up leaving carbons behind on their own. Those carbons get released as carbon dioxide. In this process of stripping off these high energy kinds of hydrogen, small amounts of energy are getting liberated and captured as ATP. So far, glycolysis and the citric acid cycle have really been making these NADH and FADH2 molecules and very small amounts of ATP. The third step of cellular respiration is called the electron transport chain. Here is where those NADH and FADH2 molecules come in handy. They're carrying these hydrogens that are carrying high energy electrons. Those high energy electrons get stripped off as part of this electron transport chain. It's an electron transport chain because the electrons are pulled away from those hydrogens and start to get moved from one protein compound in the cell to the next. Because we stripped off those electrons, we wound up having a hydrogen atom that doesn't have its electron anymore. So it becomes an H+ kind of ion. Those electrons that are stripped off move steps by step through this electron transport chain, and they lose a little bit of energy with every step. Because that energy is being lost, it has to go somewhere, and it gets captured as a lot of ATP. This electron transport chain captures a massive amount of ATP. Those reduced electrons, because they have lost energy as they've gone through these steps, wind up getting added to oxygen and splitting oxygen into a couple of O- ions. This is why oxygen is so important. Without that oxygen, these electrons wouldn't have anywhere to go, and the electron transport chain would stop working. And we wouldn't get as much ATP as we need to really power our cells and power our bodies. But now that we've split this oxygen and made these negatively charged ions, they attract the positively charged H+ ions that were produced earlier on in the electron transport chain, which results in water also being a byproduct of the cellular respiration process. We've broken down glucose, and we've made carbon dioxide in the citric acid cycle. We've used oxygen and made water during the electron transport chain. All of this biochemistry talk can get a little bit overwhelming with the names of different molecules and compounds. But what makes this process possible in the first place are these high energy electrons that are attached to the hydrogens in glucose. They're high energy because plants trapped that energy from sunlight during their own process called photosynthesis. Don't worry, for this class, we're not going through all the steps of photosynthesis. What's important, or what's interesting here, is that the energy of these high energy electrons came from sunlight. Now, because the sun is a type of star, that means all of the energy that's really being liberated and used inside of your cells and inside of your bodies came from that star. And so you are powered by starlight, which I think makes this whole thing much more interesting.